Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
Welcome to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University, Ahmedabad, established by the government of Gujarat. Today, I am here at Chaitanya Studio in the Jyotirmay campus of Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. Today, we are going to start with paper of Bachelor of Social Work. The paper code is BSWR 103. The subject is Communicative English. We are starting with block 1 today. The first block is titled Introduction to Communication. In that, we are dealing with Unit 2, that is Characteristics, Process and Principles of Communication. And today, we are dealing with the first topic, that is Characteristics and Principles of Effective Communication. Let us look at that in detail. When we look at this topic, what are the learning objectives? With this topic, we will be able to understand the characteristics of communication. We will be able to understand the principles of effective communication, which are known as the 7 C's of effective communication. Now, let us look at the characteristics of communication. Let us have the introduction first. Communication is very essential and very beneficial. Wherever we go, we do communication. And that is why we, as humans, we are social animals, and that is why we need to communicate. That is why it is always mentioned that communication is essential, that is necessary, and beneficial. That means it is advantageous. Now, why is it advantageous? Because when we communicate, whatever that is in our heads, the ideas that we have, the thoughts that we have, we need to tell it to others. So, when the others listen to that, they gain knowledge, they gain information, whereas we can share our ideas, we can share our thoughts, and that is why it is beneficial for both the sender as well as the receiver. However, before getting into the details about communication, let us understand some major characteristics of communication. Alright, so when we come to talk about the characteristics of communication, we need to understand that whenever there is communication, we at least need 2 people, the sender and the receiver. Now, this is the minimum requirement. There has to be at least 2 people or 2 persons, the sender and the receiver. No single individual can exchange the ideas by himself. So, there has to be a receiver who takes the communication, who receives the communication. For example, here there's a picture in which there are 2 people mentioned, a girl and a boy. They have certain thoughts in their ideas, certain ideas in their minds, and they tend to exchange it. So what is an exchange? Exchange is always a give and take, and that is why for every exchange there has to be a minimum of 2 persons. A listener is necessary to receive one's ideas. Therefore, there must be at least 2 persons, the sender of the information and the receiver. Now, when we talk about the sender and the receiver, let us understand who is the sender. Sender is the one who sends the information, and it can be an individual, it can be a group of people, it can be a company. Similarly, when we talk about the receiver, a receiver can also be one individual, it can be a group of people, or it can be an organization or a company. For example, right now, if I am communicating, I am the sender. If it was a classroom of all the students present here in front of me, that would have been a group of people who would be the receiver. If you are receiving this information, receiving this lecture individually, then you would be an individual receiver. Right. So, as I have already talked, the receiver can be an individual, a group of people, or an organization. Similarly for the sender. The second important characteristic is exchange of ideas. Communication cannot be thought of in the absence of exchange of ideas. That means whatever ideas that you have, whatever thoughts that you have, whatever opinions that you have to be exchanged. It cannot be kept inside your head. Otherwise, it will not be communicated. So, in order to complete the process of communication, there must be an exchange of ideas, orders, feelings, and so much more among two or more than two persons. So, the second important point is it has to be an exchange of ideas, an exchange of thoughts, an exchange of feelings. That is why it is called an exchange. It is communication between the sender and the receiver. The third important characteristic is that there has to be a mutual understanding between the sender and the receiver. Now, why is this important? Because suppose if the sender wants to say something and the receiver does not understand the same message in the same way that the sender wants it to be understood, then there is no meaning of the communication, right? So there has to be a mutual understanding between the two. Mutual understanding means that the receiver should receive the information in the same spirit with which it is being given. So whatever idea that the sender is sending, it can be through verbal communication, it can be through non-verbal communication, it can be oral, written, through signs, symbols, so many ways. But if the receiver does not understand the communicated message clearly, then there is no proper communication. And that is why mutual understanding is definitely needed. In the process of communication, it is more important to understand the information rather than carrying it out. So, you have to understand what is being told to you. It is secondary that how you carry it out, but important part is that you understand it just the way it is meant to be understood by the sender. Right? So the third important characteristic of communication is mutual understanding between the sender and the receiver. As the image says, the connection has to be there between the sender and the receiver. Moving on to the next important characteristic of communication, that is direct and indirect communication. Now, when you communicate or when the sender sends a message, it is not necessary that he will be very direct with you. Communication or sharing or exchange of ideas can be direct as well as indirect. It is a combination of both. Let us see how. It is not necessary in communication that the receiver and giver of information should be face to face with each other. It is not compulsory. For example, right now, if I am sending the message through Chaitanya Studio and you are receiving the information through your phone or through your laptop, through any channel, we are not face to face. But we are still exchanging the information. We are still exchanging knowledge, right? So this is a process, an important characteristic of communication where there is direct communication and there is indirect communication. Let us understand that in detail. Communication can be both direct and indirect. Direct communication means face-to-face conversation. When you are meeting someone, when you are going to meet someone, or when the person is face-to-face with you, then that is called direct communication. Whereas indirect communication is through any other means. It could be a video call, or it could be this way when we are communicating through external channels, then that is called indirect communication. Now, let us look at a few pictures. Yeah, so this mentions direct and indirect communication methods. This picture that is there in front of you, what will you understand or what will you think about when you look at this image? Think about it. What are the basic concepts that you can think of when you look at this image? It can be that the person does not want to look at that. It can be there's something not very beautiful or not very pretty on that paper. Possibly it is his result and he does not want to see that. That means when you look at the picture, when you look at the sign that he is doing, we understand that this is not something that he wants. A picture is communicating a feeling, a communication of a feeling of dislike, let us say. Right? So just one picture can make us realize that this is the feeling of dislike. Look at the next picture. This little boy. We can understand that here Either he's very confused in what he's doing, or he does not understand in whatever he is doing, or he just does not want to do anything, right? So with just one picture, we can have the feeling expressed. It can be confusion, it can be boredom. So many things can be described using one picture. And this is indirect communication. All right. Look at this picture again. If someone does this to you, what does that mean? Again, that could be dislike. Again, that could be irritation. Again, that could be frustration, sadness, anger. So many things can be communicated through just one picture. These are the forms of indirect ways of communication. All right, now compare these two pictures. What can you say about these two humans here? The first person, that is in person A, does not like it. So this can be termed as dislike. The other person, the person B, there is possible fear, right? Astonishment, surprise, shock. How can you say that? You look at the picture and you feel this, right? So these are the different ways in which indirect communication can be sent to the receiver. All right, now there is a bunch of pictures here. You tell me, find out which are the faces which give us positive energy and which are the faces that give us negative energy. Take some time. Look at all the photos. Look at all the people here. There are certain in which the people are smiling. There are certain in which people are frowning. There are certain people who are astonished, who are surprised. There are some people who are frustrated. There are some people who are angry. So many emotions, so many feelings can be conveyed just using the facial expressions. This is indirect way of communication. All right. Communication is a continuous process that goes on and on and on. Communication is an endless process, because if I am the sender and if suppose you are the receiver, then if I send a message to you, you receive the message. That is not the end of the process of communication. You give a feedback, and in that feedback, you become the sender, I become the receiver. And then again, I send a message, then this goes on and on and on. And thus, communication is a continuous process. Communication is an endless process. It goes on with or without our knowledge. We might not be aware of what is going on around us. We might not be aware that we are sending a message. We might not be aware of our expressions. We might not be aware of how we are standing up, how we are communicating. But still, communication goes on. We keep sending signals through verbal and non-verbal communication, and that is why it goes on and on and on. Use of words as well as symbols. Now, when we communicate, it is not just words. It is not just verbal communication. It is not just oral communication. It is not just written communication. But we also use signs and symbols to communicate. How? Let us see. There can be many means of communication, that is the written, the oral, and the symbolic. That is called verbal communication and the non-verbal communication. All right. Now, suppose if you look at this image, what is the one thing that comes to your mind, the first thing that comes to your mind? Possibly joy. Now it is break time. Now we can go home, right? So just this one, a beautiful simple picture, but we can even imagine the sound that was created using this, right? This is a beautiful memory that we might all have had during our childhood. This is the memory of the school being closed for the day, or possibly for the recess, right? So these are the memories that come across when we look at this picture. So this is a pictorial representation of what a feeling can be expressed. Look at this. Now, suppose if a person, when you talk to someone or when you are communicating with someone and the person does this, what does that mean? It definitely means a no in most of the cultures. Whereas if the person does this, we can understand that the person is either agreeing, or the person is saying yes, or the person has understood what you're trying to say. right? So simple ways of communication. In this, we do not need to mention anything. This means a no, this means a yes. That again is just symbolic way of communication. All right, now look at this image. I'm very sure that all of you recognize that this sign means out. Look at this picture. It is the same mode of communication. It is the same method. It is the same symbol. Does this mean the same thing? This means out. This means that the person wants to answer something, right? The method of communication is the same, but the message that is delivered is different. So even one sign, even one symbol, even one way of communicating can have more than one meanings. That depends on the culture, that depends on the situation, that depends on so many different contexts. So this is a part where there is communication done through oral communication, in a way of oral communication, through written communication, or through the symbolic way of communication. I hope this is clear for now. We move on to the second part of this question, that is the principles of effective communication. The principles of effective communication mention that communication is essential and helpful if that is done properly. So, of course, if you need to be understood well, then you have to be very good at communication. If you communicate well, then you will be understood well. Communication is essential and helpful only if it is done properly. There are 7 principles of effective communication, which are also called the 7 C's of effective communication. Why they are called 7 C's of effective communication is because all these 7 words that we are going to look at right now begin with the letter C. All right, so let us look at that. These are the 7 C's of communication. Let us begin to understand that one by one. The first C, the important characteristic of communication, the principles of effective communication, the first is completeness. That means whenever you are sending a message, now let us look at an example. That means if you're writing a letter to someone, as a student of Bachelor of Social Work, you might need to communicate using letters. You might need to write a few letters to someone, to an organization, to an NGO, or to some people. When you are writing the letter should be complete. Now, what does that mean? To be effective, communication should be complete. It should include all the information that the recipient, that means the receiver, needs to evaluate its content, solve a problem, or make a decision. That means if at all you are sending a letter, then everything, every little detail that the person might need must be sent through your letter or through the way you are communicating. Complete communication reduces the need for follow-up questions. That means if you have already mentioned everything in your letter, if you have already mentioned everything during your way of communication, then there is no need of follow-up questions, right? And follow-up questions and answers, of course, and improves the quality of the overall communication process, right? So with that, when the entire message is very complete, it has all the details that are needed, it is mentioned completely, then there are no barriers to communication, and the overall communication becomes very simple, very perfect. The second is conciseness. Now, conciseness means that it should be precise, it should be small. That means you should not elongate or lengthen the entire message that you want to mention or you want to share, right? That means that if you want to, send something, if you want to say something to someone, you do not need to repeat one and the same thing again and again. It should be small, it should be concise. Conciseness is not keeping the messages short, but it is about keeping it to the point. There is a beautiful saying in English that means beating about the bush. That means not coming to the point, going round and round and round, saying so many things that are unwanted, and you do not come to the point directly. So when you are doing that, You are also confused, you also do not know what to say, and the most important part is that the receiver will not understand what you're going to say, right? So instead of that, the message that you want to share should be concise, should be small, should be precise. Conciseness in communication happens when the message does not include any redundant or irrelevant information, right? That means the information that is not needed should not be included in your message, in your way of communication. Concise communication prompts a better understanding of the message because the recipient can focus on the key points and does not get distracted by minor details. That means that when you receive a short message, right, then the receiver will understand just the important part. He will gather the important part, and the other part, which could be distractive, could be removed from that, right? Suppose if you want to send a message to someone that so and so and had called and he wanted to talk to you. Just a simple message: Mr. XYZ called, please call him back at this time. This is a concise message. But if you just write down that Mr. XYZ had called and he talked about so many things and he asked how is the health of you and your neighbors and your family members, and then he mentioned that his family members are very fine, he was suffering from a few diseases but now he's fine, and he also mentioned that he wanted to talk to you and you should call him back at around, I do not know, remember the time, but I think it should be around 6 o'clock. This is not the way you should communicate. Your message should be concise, short, precise. He called back at this time. Concise, short. That means the person will understand it better. The third important principle is consideration. Now, what is consideration? Suppose when you are engaging in communication, you should always consider and value the recipient's needs, moods, and the points of view. Suppose if you are communicating with someone who does not belong to your social, cultural society, then how do you communicate with them? If you're communicating with someone who is not belonging to, let us say, your country, will you talk to the person in the same way in which you communicate with your friends? Or suppose if you are meeting someone who does not belong to your religion, let us say, or to your social strata, let us say, would you be talking to the same person as you communicate with your family members? No, you should always consider the audience. You should always consider the recipient, that is the receiver's needs, moods, and points of view. There might be people who have different thoughts. That might be people who have different political views, cultural views, religious views. You have to respect them. That is called consideration. Tailoring the contents and style of your messages based on the target audience. Right? Tailoring means that you make the communication in such a way that it is very specific. We say personalized communication, right? Based on the target audience, strengthens the key points delivered within, as the sender can use argumentations and examples that are relevant to the recipient's experience. Now, suppose, for example, if I say that when we are talking to you, I know that you are the students of Bachelor of Social Work, and suppose if I give you the examples of how a doctor works, or how the policeman should work, or how a teacher works, that might be irrelevant to so many of you. If I am talking to the students of Bachelor of Social Work, then I should have the examples focusing on how you should communicate, right? That is what consideration means. This caters for a more thorough understanding of the message. Then you will be able to actually relate with the information and you will be able to understand the message perfectly and clearly well. The message should be concrete. So concreteness is one of the principles of effective communication. Effective communication happens when the message is supported by facts and figures. Concreteness in communication is also about answering to the questions timely and consistently and developing your argumentations based on real life examples and situations rather than on general scenarios or theories. That means that whenever you are mentioning something, whenever you're talking about something, you should understand the audience first, right? You should develop your arguments, you should develop your examples based on what can be relevant to the audience. And you should always use facts and figures wherever that is possible, right? That means that it gives concreteness to your message. Concreteness fosters effectiveness in communication. That means it provides an effective way of communication because the recipient gets a more comprehensive overview of the message and its implication. The person understands it very well. He can relate with the message very well. That is concreteness. Moving on to the next point, courtesy. Courtesy in communication implies being respectful to the other person's culture, to their values and beliefs. You should respect them. There has to be a feeling of you first when you talk to someone. It involves the need to adopt a register your audience can easily relate to and understand. That means that when you are talking, your audience should understand what you're trying to say. Courteous communication has a positive impact on the overall communication as it prompts a more positive and constructive approach to the conversation, right? So there has to be you first approach when you're talking to someone. Next is clarity. That means your message should be clear. To be effective, communication has to be clear and specific. To achieve clarity, the message should focus on one single objective, which emphasizes its importance and it caters from a prompt understanding of its content. Right? If you're not clear of what you're saying, or if the person does not get clarity of what you're saying, that there's no effective communication mentioned there. Clear communication also requires the adoption of the relevant terminology, thus reducing ambiguities and confusion in the communication process. That means that suppose if I say that I met an ophthalmologist. So ophthalmologist is a word that we use for the doctors who treat the eyes. But we generally do not use the term. This is called the terminology. That means the words that are used for a particular group of students only or for a particular group of people only. Ophthalmologist, the doctors will understand that we are talking about an eye specialist, but general people might not be able to understand. So use relevant terminology, use relevant words. And this reduces ambiguities, this reduces confusion, and the communication is made more clear. So wherever there is confusion, clear it up with the clear picture. All right, next. The next principle of communication, effective communication, is correctness. Using grammar and syntax correctly vouches for increased effectiveness and credibility of the message. That means whatever you are mentioning, whatever you are communicating should be grammatically correct, right? Grammar and syntax mistakes make it harder for the recipient to decode the message and understand its content. What happens is that when you read a message or when you receive a message that is not grammatically correct, you first have to, decode the message. And then you will be able to understand it. So your message should be correct in the form of grammar, in the form of syntax, in the way of pronunciation possibly, or punctuation ways. They have a negative impact on the overall communication. If the message is not clear, it has a negative impact because that shows that the sender has not taken time to craft the messages more carefully. So the messages have to be correct as well. These are the 7 C's of effective communication. 7 C's because we saw that all those words begin with the letter C, right? So these are called the 7 C's of effective communication. The images that we have used here are from Google Images. Thank you so much.